It begins with a strange discovery, one so unbelievable that even the pilots who saw it with their own eyes refused to accept it. In the late years of World War II, a group of Japanese aviators found themselves standing on a lonely airfield, staring at an American fighter they believed shouldn't exist in their world. A bulky, rugged machine with wide wings, thick armor, and a presence that looked more like a sledgehammer than a sleek, elegant sword. It was an F6F Hellcat, and the Japanese Empire had somehow captured one. What happened next would leave them completely stunned. They would test fly the Hellcat themselves, push it to its limits, and come back shaken, whispering to their officers that the aircraft's climb power wasn't just strong, it was impossible. But that moment, that shock, didn't begin in the sky. It started with a survivor. Somewhere over the Pacific, months before this test flight, an American pilot had been forced to ditch his Hellcat after a brutal dogfight. His aircraft hit the ocean, bounced, and slowly disappeared beneath the surface. But the engine wasn't fully dead, and the sea, calm for once, didn't swallow the machine entirely. It stayed afloat long enough to drift, long enough to be found by someone who wasn't supposed to find it. A Japanese recovery vessel, patrolling for wreckage, spotted the floating fighter and hauled it aboard. The crew didn't celebrate. They stared at it in disbelief because they knew exactly what they were looking at. The F6F Hellcat was the plane that had been shredding their fighters, dominating the skies over the Pacific and turning air battles into nightmares. Pilots had reported dogfights where Hellcats dove straight through attacks that should have killed them, where the American fighters pulled away in climbs that defied every calculation and expectation Japanese engineers believed in. And now, here one was, intact, real, something they could touch. When the plane arrived at a Japanese airfield for inspection, engineers crowded around like they were examining an alien life form. They had so many questions. How could a machine this heavy climb so fast? How could a plane built like a tank still turn well enough to compete with nimble fighters? And how did American designers make something so simple yet so brutally effective? They removed panels. They felt the metal with their hands. They crawled under the wings and around the landing gear. The aircraft looked crude at first glance, almost ugly compared to the sleek inline engine fighters Japan was known for. But beneath that rough exterior, they began noticing something frightening. Everything had been designed for battle survival. Everything had been created with the mindset that the pilot must live long enough to fight again the next day. One mechanic tapped the armor plate behind the cockpit and muttered the equivalent of "This is ridiculous." Another lifted a fuel line and stared at its self-sealing insulation. "This is why they don't go up in flames," he said quietly. And when one engineer opened the cowling and saw the massive 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine, he just exhaled slowly. Someone standing behind him whispered, "No wonder our Zero can't keep up." But piece by piece, the aircraft revealed secrets they weren't expecting. The controls were heavy but reliable. The wings were reinforced. The hydraulics were clean and efficient. Nothing felt cheap or rushed. It was a weapon built not for elegance, but for raw performance and battlefield brutality. Still, looking at it on the ground was one thing. Flying it, feeling what American pilots felt, that was something else entirely. So after weeks of tuning, checking, repairing, and making the aircraft airworthy again, the Imperial Japanese Navy chose a pilot to take off in the captured Hellcat. The man selected was an experienced flyer, one who had fought many battles, survived crashes, and carried the quiet confidence of someone who knew machines better than most. He didn't smile when he walked toward the aircraft. He placed a hand on the fuselage and stood there for a moment, almost as if greeting a dangerous animal. No one spoke. Even the mechanics stepped back. The entire hangar felt tense, like they all knew something important was about to happen, something that could change the way they understood the American war machine. The pilot climbed the ladder, slid into the cockpit, and closed the canopy with a heavy, echoing click. The ground crew stepped away. The engine coughed once, twice, then roared to life with a power that made several men flinch. Smoke curled around the propeller. The aircraft trembled, eager to move. Then the throttle advanced, and the Hellcat rolled. As it lifted into the air, one mechanic muttered, "It shouldn't climb well. Too heavy." Another shook his head. But American planes don't follow our logic anymore. Minutes passed. The aircraft climbed higher and higher until it became a shrinking dot against the pale sky. The Japanese pilot inside was beginning to feel something he couldn't explain. He pushed the throttle and felt the Hellcat surge. He pulled back on the stick and felt the aircraft rise with a strength that almost shocked him. It didn't feel like a heavy fighter anymore. It felt alive, like it wanted to leap upward the moment he touched the controls. He pushed it again, harder. The climb didn't slow. The engine didn't complain. At a point where any Japanese fighter he knew would begin to struggle, the Hellcat kept going. It wasn't just strong, it was relentless. By the time he brought the plane back down, the pilot's face was tight with disbelief. The ground crew rushed over, asking what he thought. He didn't answer. He just stared at the aircraft like it had betrayed everything he believed about American engineering. When the officers insisted he speak, he finally said only one thing: "The climb is impossible." His voice didn't shake, but everyone listening felt a chill, because they could hear the truth in it. And that was only the beginning. The pilot had tested only a fraction of what the Hellcat could do, and the most shocking discoveries were still waiting in the sky. As the sun set over the airfield, the officers gathered for a second test flight, one that would push the Hellcat further, faster, and deeper into maneuvers no Japanese aircraft at the time could match. What the pilot would find in that next flight would challenge everything Japan thought it knew about American fighters and expose weaknesses in their own designs they could no longer ignore. The second test flight was supposed to be routine, a simple confirmation of what the first pilot felt. But the officers wanted more. They wanted proof. They wanted numbers. And deep down, some of them didn't want to believe the report at all. One pilot calling the Hellcat's climb impossible was alarming. Two pilots confirming it would be terrifying. So on the following morning, before the sun had fully risen, a group of Japanese officers, engineers, and mechanics gathered around the aircraft once again, their breath fogged in the cool air. The captured Hellcat sat silent, covered with dew, almost peaceful, like a giant beast sleeping under a thin blanket. This time, the pilot chosen was younger, but known for pushing aircraft harder than anyone else. He had a reputation for fearlessness, even recklessness. Some officers thought he was the perfect choice. "If anyone can find this plane's limits," one whispered, "it's him." The young pilot walked around the aircraft slowly. He didn't study it like the engineers. He didn't touch the fuselage like the veteran before him. Instead, he stared at it with curiosity and a kind of challenge in his eyes, as if he wanted to see who would win, him or the machine. He strapped in, adjusted the unfamiliar American controls, and fired the engine. The Hellcat woke instantly, as if it had been waiting for another chance to prove itself. The propeller washed the ground crew in a blast of warm air and dust as it taxied toward the runway. No one spoke as it rolled. No one moved. They just watched. The aircraft gathered speed, lifted off the ground, and began climbing. And within seconds, the young pilot realized the first test pilot hadn't exaggerated anything. If anything, he might have underplayed it. The plane didn't feel like it was climbing. It felt like something invisible was pulling it upward. The young pilot narrowed his eyes, pushed the throttle forward, and aimed higher. The Hellcat responded instantly, its engine roaring with a deep, confident growl. He checked his gauges. He checked his rate of climb. His jaw tightened. This wasn't normal. When a plane climbs, you can feel the strain. You can hear the engine groan, or feel the controls get sloppy as the air thins. But the Hellcat felt clean and steady. The stick stayed firm. The controls didn't soften. Even at altitudes where Japanese fighters like the Zero began to gasp for performance, the Hellcat kept lunging upward like it had endless strength in reserve. He tried leveling off. The plane accelerated with surprising speed. Not the kind of blistering speed you'd expect from a racer, but the kind that feels steady and unstoppable, like a heavy axe swinging through the air with momentum too great to counter. Then, with barely a breath of hesitation, The pilot yanked the stick and rolled the aircraft. And this is where he froze. The roll didn't feel sluggish at all. The aircraft didn't hesitate. It didn't wobble. It rolled cleanly, smoothly, like a much lighter fighter. He performed a second roll, then a third. He pushed the plane into a steep turn. The Hellcat bit into the maneuver and held it with strength he simply wasn't expecting. Japanese fighters were known for agility, not durability. They were feather-light, graceful, and quick to react, but fragile. A hard turn or steep dive could rip wings apart if the pilot wasn't careful. But the Hellcat? The Hellcat was performing these maneuvers like a machine that simply refused to break. He felt the G-forces push him into the seat. He tightened his grip and pulled harder, expecting the plane to complain. It didn't. In the hangar below, engineers watched the Hellcat trace clean arcs across the sky. One officer muttered under his breath, "That shouldn't be possible. Not at that weight." Another whispered the part no one wanted to say out loud. "This means our fighters may be outmatched in ways we never understood." Up above, the young pilot wasn't done. He pushed the Hellcat into a shallow dive, then pulled up hard, harder than he would dare in a zero. He expected a shudder or a warning vibration. He got nothing, just smooth, relentless power. He tried a vertical climb. The plane did something that made him blink inside the canopy. It didn't stall at the point he expected. It didn't fall away. The nose hung for a moment, the engine howled, and the aircraft kept going, clawing the sky, refusing to drop. His disbelief turned to something else. Not fear, not admiration, something between the two. A feeling that this aircraft wasn't just better. It represented an entirely different philosophy of war. And suddenly, something clicked in his mind. This was why so many Japanese pilots have been lost. They were going up against machines with twice the horsepower, machines built to take hits and keep fighting, machines that didn't punish their pilots for pushing the limits. For years, Japan believed the Zero's agility alone would win battles. But agility didn't matter against raw power and unshakable durability. Down below, the officers could see the Hellcat coming down for landing at last. The engine throttled back. The landing gear dropped. The plane touched down heavier than a Zero, but safely and with control. The pilot climbed out of the cockpit. The ground crew rushed in, waiting for his reaction. But he didn't speak. He sat on the wing and stared at the runway, breathing hard, like he had just come face to face with some truth he didn't want to accept. An officer finally approached him. "Report." The pilot didn't look up. He just shook his head slowly, as if trying to find the right words. And when he finally did speak, his voice was low. "It climbs like nothing we have. It turns better than it should. The power never ends." And he hesitated and took a deep breath. "And if these are the machines America is sending into battle now, we are fighting an enemy far ahead of us." The officers exchanged uneasy looks. The pilot wasn't exaggerating. He wasn't emotional. He was simply telling them the truth, a truth he had felt in the sky, in the stick, in every maneuver. The engineers closed in around him, asking about controls, power curves, roll rate, torque vibrations. But the pilot kept returning to the same idea. It just shouldn't be able to do what it does. Not at that size. Not at that weight. He rubbed his forehead, exhausted. How do you beat something built like this? No one answered, because no one knew anymore. Across the field, the Hellcat stood silently again, its engine ticking as it cooled, as if listening to their fear. But the testing wasn't over. The Japanese officers needed more answers. They needed to test the weapons systems, the dive performance, the stall behavior, the energy retention. And one of them had an idea, dangerous but necessary. They wanted to simulate a real dogfight. A Japanese Zero against the captured Hellcat. What happened in that final test would reveal the deepest truth yet, and it would shake the Japanese command to the core. The idea sounded reckless the moment it was spoken aloud. A simulated dogfight, Japanese Zero versus the captured American Hellcat. Even the officers who approved it knew the danger. One mistake could destroy their only working Hellcat. But they needed answers, and not just technical answers. Answers about survival, strategy, and the future of their pilots. On the morning of the test, Two aircraft were wheeled out onto the airstrip. The Japanese Zero, sleek, sharp, and feather-light, as familiar to the pilots as breathing. And across from it, the Hellcat, broad and powerful, looking almost lazy by comparison. But anyone who had seen it in the previous tests knew better. There was nothing lazy about what lived inside that engine. The two pilots chosen strapped into their cockpits. The Zero's pilot had years of combat experience and a reputation for precision. The Hellcat's pilot was the same man who had flown it in Part 1. The calm, veteran flyer who respected machines the way other men respected the ocean. Between the two of them, there was mutual respect, but also something that made both of them quiet. They knew this wasn't just a test. It was a glimpse into the truth of the war. The radio crackled. Climb to 2,000 meters. Begin on my signal. The engines fired. The Zero hummed. The Hellcat roared. They lifted into the sky like two completely different philosophies taking flight. One built on finesse, the other on unstoppable force. At altitude, they lined up. The signal came. Begin. The Zero broke first, banking hard, swinging into a tight circle with ease. The Hellcat followed, slower to roll, but shockingly able to hold the turn. The Zero pilot expected to gain angle quickly. He was used to it. He'd done it countless times in real battles. But something was wrong. The Hellcat wasn't falling behind. He tightened the turn. The Zero strained, its wings flexing, its airframe trembling on the edge of what it could handle. But the Hellcat held the circle with a power that seemed to defy geometry. It wasn't graceful, but it didn't need to be. It was muscling through a maneuver that should have favored the Zero. The battle shifted into climbs. The Zero shot upward lightly, but halfway through the maneuver, its momentum faded. The pilot glanced over his shoulder and felt a chill. The Hellcat was still climbing. Not just climbing, surging. It rose past him like a machine that didn't understand the concept of weight. The Zero pilot's eyes widened. He whispered to himself how, below them, the officers watching through binoculars saw something they had never seen before. Their best fighter losing ground in the vertical to an aircraft twice its size. Then came the dives. The Zero dove like a swallow, smooth, quick, slicing the air. But the Hellcat dove like a falling mountain, faster, heavier, terrifyingly stable. The Zero pilot pushed harder, feeling his aircraft tremble as he built speed. But the Hellcat didn't tremble at all. It stayed rock solid, the dive only increasing its advantage. The American engineers had built this plane to survive brutal dives and still fight afterward. And now the Japanese pilots were seeing that design philosophy up close, for the first time, and too late. The next moment changed everything. The Zero pilot tried to pull up sharply from his dive. Normally, the aircraft handled it well. Quick, light, responsive. But this time, under high G-load, the Zero shook. Not badly, but enough to remind him of its limits. He eased off, taking care not to stress the wings. Behind him, the Hellcat pulled up harder. Much harder. And nothing happened. No rattling, no flexing. Just raw force, carving through the air like a blade of steel. The Zero pilot felt something he hadn't felt in years. Fear. Not of dying, but fear of the truth. They switched to scissors maneuvers. The Zero weaved and sliced with its usual elegance, but the Hellcat, though slower to react, didn't lose control. It didn't bleed energy the way the Zero did. It retained speed, power, and authority in every move. By the time both pilots leveled off to end the test, they were silent. The Zero pilot landed first, rolling to a stop and shutting down his engine. The ground crew opened the canopy. He didn't climb out immediately. He sat there with his head bowed, hands resting on his legs, breathing heavily. Not tired, just shaken. The Hellcat pilot landed moments later. When he stepped down, the officers surrounded him again, but this time he didn't wait for questions. He said quietly, "If this had been a real battle, I wouldn't want to fight against it." They asked why. He stared at the Hellcat, its still warm engine ticking softly. It takes everything the Zero does well and just overpowers it. Climb, dive, strength, endurance. Our planes weren't built for this kind of opponent. The Zero pilot finally joined them, his expression dark and honest. I tried everything, he admitted. Every trick, every move. Nothing changed the outcome. A long silence followed. For the officers, that silence was heavier than the roar of any engine, because they understood what it truly meant. The war in the air had changed. Not because Japan lacked courage or skill, but because the enemy had built machines on a different scale entirely. The captured Hellcat was rolled back into the hangar. Engineers would continue to study it, measure it, analyze it. But the pilots already knew the truth. What they had felt in the sky was more honest than any report. The Hellcat wasn't unbeatable, but it was a weapon that demanded respect, and it explained, painfully, why so many battles in the Pacific had turned against them. As the day ended, the veteran pilot placed a hand on the Hellcat's fuselage one last time. He whispered something the others couldn't hear. Maybe it was admiration, maybe it was frustration, maybe both. But as he walked away, he said one final sentence. Not to anyone in particular, but to the airfield itself. This plane shows why the war is slipping from our hands. And just like that, the testing was over. The aircraft that had once been an enemy now became a silent teacher. One that revealed truths Japan had never wanted to see, but could no longer ignore. The story of the captured Hellcat would remain hidden from the public, buried in reports and memories. But the pilots who flew it never forgot. They had felt the future of aerial warfare in their hands, and they knew the world after the war would never be the same. Thank you for watching this documentary-style story. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support helps bring more historical stories to life.